Out of, I think it's about 300 songs that John and I wrote together, we never had a dry session.
Freddie Mercury versus Paul McCartney. In tonight's feature, we begin with a rivalry that rocked the very foundations of British music, pitting two of the most theatrical frontmen against each other, Paul McCartney and Queen's flamboyant leader Freddie Mercury. Reports trace the tension back to 1976 at London's Air Studios, where Queen and Wings were recording at the same time. Studio engineer Mike Stone later recalled that Mercury mocked McCartney's silly love songs with an earshot, a jab at what he considered music that was too safe, too middle of the road, and far removed from the daring operatic masterpieces Queen was producing. The animosity spilled into the public arena at the 1977 Brit Awards, where Mercury allegedly refused to share a table with McCartney, dismissing his songs as airplane music. But the conflict reached its peak at Live Aid in 1985, when backstage organizers were pressured to reshuffle the running order after Mercury reportedly declared, "No one follows Queen." The result was iconic. Queen delivered one of the most legendary sets in rock history while McCartney faced technical difficulties, an outcome Mercury himself highlighted as the difference between pioneers and followers. Behind the bravado was a genuine clash of philosophies. Mercury championed theatricality and grandeur while McCartney stood by his melodic craftsmanship. Though they shared similar classical influences, they never bridged the gap, leaving us to wonder what might have been had collaboration, not competition, won the day. Yoko Ono versus Paul McCartney. Moving to number 5, the saga of Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono is one of rock history's most enduring Cold Wars, rooted in the chaotic final years of the Beatles. According to insiders, McCartney often bristled at Yoko's constant presence in the studio, once venting to roadie Mal Evans that every time he looked up from his bass, she was perched on an amplifier, starring. Tensions escalated when Yoko allegedly began offering unsolicited feedback on Paul's bass parts, prompting him to storm out of a session. Following the Beatles' breakup, the divide deepened further when McCartney filed the lawsuit that legally dissolved the band, a move Yoko reportedly described as the ultimate betrayal. The feud's most public flashpoint came in 1971 with Lennon's searing track, How Do You Sleep?, which many claim Yoko helped to pen, firing direct lyrical shots at McCartney's artistry. Even decades later, at a 2006 private event, Yoko reportedly remarked that Paul was always about Paul no matter the pretense. Meanwhile, McCartney privately likened working with Yoko to collaborating with someone who spoke a different language entirely. Despite polite public gestures of reconciliation, sources insist the rift never fully healed. Their clash symbolized more than personal animosity. It reflected an irreconcilable split in artistic vision, one that permanently shaped the legacy of the Beatles and colored McCartney's story with undertones of betrayal and bitterness. Frank Zappa versus Paul McCartney. At number 4, we arrive at perhaps the most intellectual clash of McCartney's career, a feud with the avant-garde provocateur Frank Zappa that was as much about philosophy as it was about music. The trouble reportedly began in 1967 when Zappa released We're Only in It for the Money, a satirical album whose artwork openly parodied the Beatles' SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. When McCartney and Zappa finally crossed paths backstage at the Miami Pop Festival in 1968, witnesses recall Paul being icy and muttering that he didn't appreciate being mocked by what he called musical circus acts. Zappa fired back in a 1971 interview, accusing McCartney of milking a formula to death and calling him incapable of recognizing true innovation. The feud escalated further during a mid-70s television special, when McCartney insisted on separate dressing rooms and schedules to avoid any contact, later quipping to associates that Zappa's music sounded like someone had pushed an orchestra down a staircase. Never one to back down, Zappa countered in front of his own bandmates that Paul equated 3 chords and a catchy chorus with musical genius, a sign in his view of how low pop standards had fallen. What made this conflict so potent was that it reflected 2 starkly different ideologies: McCartney's devotion to melody and accessibility versus Zappa's uncompromising vision of experimentation, complexity, and satire. Their feud was less about personal dislike and more about representing opposite ends of the rock spectrum, the populist craftsman and the avant-garde critic, a clash that embodied rock's eternal tug-of-war between mass appeal and radical artistry. Keith Richards versus Paul McCartney. Our countdown now turns to number 3, where the Rolling Stones' iconic guitarist Keith Richards emerges as one of McCartney's most consistent detractors. Though the Beatles and Stones were marketed as friendly rivals, behind closed doors the rivalry was far more caustic. Richards reportedly dismissed McCartney's songs as granny music, mocking tracks like Martha My Dear, and When I'm 64 as examples of Paul's tendency toward overly polished music hall stylings. When the Stones attempted to answer SGT, Pepper with their own psychedelic experiment, Their Satanic Majesty's Request in 1967, only to be met with lukewarm reviews, Keith allegedly blamed Paul directly, telling friends they had been tricked into playing his game. The bitterness surfaced again at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1988, when Paul offered Richards a compliment only to be rebuffed with the scathing line, "Save your pleasantries for your press conferences, at least Lennon had some edge to him." Later, in a 2003 documentary, Keith sharpened the point even further by declaring, "Paul plays at being a rocker, some of us actually are rockers." For Richards, McCartney's meticulous approach embodied everything rock should resist: propriety, precision, and politeness. For McCartney, the disdain was baffling given his record of innovation. Yet both men understood that their public roles fueled the mythology of rock. The Stones as the gritty outlaws, the Beatles as the melodic architects. In that sense, their personal Cold War reflected the music world's deeper debate about authenticity and polish, about whether rock should wear a suit or a scar. John Lennon versus Paul McCartney. Sliding into number 2, we confront the most tragic rivalry of them all, the unraveling of the Lennon-McCartney partnership. What began as one of the most powerful songwriting collaborations in history dissolved into a bitter feud that played out both in studios and on record sleeves. After manager Brian Epstein's death, Paul attempted to take on a leadership role within the Beatles, a move Lennon reportedly resented, telling friends he refused to let Paul play daddy. Beatles engineer Geoff Emerick recalled sessions turning hostile, with Lennon dismissing Paul's songs as sentimental granny music, while McCartney criticized Lennon's avant-garde experiments as self-indulgent noise. The collapse became public after the breakup, with Lennon releasing How Do You Sleep? In 1971, a venomous track that accused Paul of irrelevance and mocked his recent work. Lennon doubled down in a Rolling Stone interview the same year, claiming Paul's songs were the worst, singling out Maxwell's Silver Hammer as unbearable. Even as late as 1980, during the Double Fantasy sessions, Lennon contrasted his own raw emotional writing with Paul's lighter fare, declaring they were destined to clash. And yet, behind the fiery words lay a bond too deep to be erased. Lennon's girlfriend May Pang revealed that during his Lost Weekend, he confided that nobody understood him like Paul. Tragically, their tentative reconciliation was cut short by Lennon's murder, leaving their story unfinished. Their feud showed how the very differences that created magic also sowed division, proving that the greatest partnerships often contain the seeds of their own destruction. Elvis Costello versus Paul McCartney. Finally, at number 1, we arrive at the most surprising name on this list: Elvis Costello, the sharp-tongued new wave poet who once positioned himself as McCartney's antithesis. Bursting onto the late 70s punk scene, Costello openly mocked McCartney, telling the press that Paul symbolized everything wrong with rock: wealthy, comfortable, and writing lightweight, silly love songs while the world unraveled. In his early gigs, Costello would reportedly lampoon Let It Be and mangle performances designed to parody McCartney's sincerity. Yet in one of music's most ironic twists, this animosity transformed into collaboration in 1987 when Paul invited Costello to co-write. Those sessions were tense, with Costello pushing McCartney harder than he'd been pushed in years. But the results included My Brave Face and That Day Is Done, songs hailed by critics as Paul's strongest in decades. Costello later admitted he had spent years hating Paul simply for being Paul McCartney, only to realize that very quality was what made him great. Their relationship revealed how rivalries can evolve into respect, how biting critique can sharpen an artist's edge, and how even the most unlikely pairings can produce timeless work. What began as disdain ended in mutual recognition, closing our list not with bitterness but with an ironic reminder. Sometimes your sharpest critic becomes your most valuable collaborator, and sometimes hate is just the prelude to harmony. And so, as we conclude tonight's investigation into the musicians who reportedly could not stand Paul McCartney, what becomes clear is that behind the familiar smile and polished reputation lies a man who has sparked some of the most dramatic tensions in rock history. Freddie Mercury clashed with Paul over artistic credibility and Live Aid's legacy. Yoko Ono embodied the fracture of the Beatles, family, and the bitterness of legal battles. Frank Zappa ridiculed McCartney's melodic instincts as formulaic, while Paul dismissed Zappa's complexity as chaos. Keith Richards kept the Beatles-Stones rivalry alive with his accusations of granny music. John Lennon weaponized both lyrics and interviews to expose the rawest wounds of their partnership. And Elvis Costello, once a sneering punk critic, ended up discovering respect through collaboration. Together, these rivalries sketch a portrait of Paul not as the endlessly agreeable, cute Beatle, but as a powerful figure who divided opinion, drew fire, and ultimately sharpened his legacy in the crucible of conflict. In a sense, the fact that such towering names lined up against him is proof of his impact. Nobody wastes words on an artist who doesn't matter. And while some of these rifts softened over time and others ended in tragedy, all of them underscore the central truth of McCartney's career. His melodic genius was impossible to ignore, and whether it inspired admiration or disdain, it ensured that his story would remain the center of rock's most unforgettable debates.